Welcome to APH Freedom of Movement, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Leanne, and welcome. We are super glad that you could be with us here today on this Friday. I'm going to go over today's agenda. Our introductions are going to be a little longer than what they usually are, but it wouldn't be Friday without a fun question to throw out in your direction. So after I do our overview of the day, I'm going to have Leanne bring up that fun question for us. So today's agenda is as follows. I'm going to start out talking a little bit about the APH Innovations line. We're going to talk about objectives. And then Daniel will get into his presentation, freedom of movement. Now, throughout the course of the presentation, you're welcome to throw your comments and your questions into the chat. In fact, we encourage you to do so. And what we will do is stop periodically to field those questions. Just a reminder that this presentation is an hour and a half, so you'll be getting 1.5 hours of CEUs if you are interested in that. And so before I go any further, Leanne, do you want to throw out today's question as we get things started?
So here is our Fun Question Friday. What is your favorite thing about the pandemic? So the choices we gave you were family time, better connections with people I work with, less travel and a much needed rest, or other. And if you select other, we want to hear it in the chat. What was your other? What is your favorite thing about the pandemic? So far, no need for makeup, and clothing is optional. Do you want more family time, better connections with people you work with, less travel, and a much needed rest? Or other, being able to work from home, more gardening, preparing for a baby and spending time snuggling with the dogs, less traffic, cleaning my house, being able to attend Zoom and remote webinars and networking, learning new ways to teach, home projects. You guys got some great others in there. Wish I would have had you when we were creating the poll. Okay, I'm going to end this poll, let you see what you guys selected, and we do see 40% less travel and a much needed rest. I do have to agree. 26% other, 25% family time, 9% better connections with people I work with. Less money on gas we're seeing in there, working from home, more time with fur babies, organizing my closet. I am so glad you have found some positives in this pandemic.
Yeah, fun to look at. So Daniel, great question as we get started today. All right, so as I mentioned, the introduction today is going to just be a bit longer. We'll be introducing Daniel as well as the book that he co-authored. But before we get started with that, I wanted to talk just briefly about the American Printing House's Innovations line of products. This is something that's relatively new. The Innovations line of product is really a curation of products that began in January of 2019. The idea behind it was to identify solutions that were forward-thinking, that were mission-driven, right? Achieving the mission of the printing house, that they would be tools for lifelong learning, that they would be tools for young children birth through college and then beyond. These solutions are not available on quota, and if you want to learn more about some of these solutions as we continue to build them out, you can reach out to sales@aph.org. So in a moment, I'll introduce you to a product called the TactPlus, but what I want to mention is that as we succeed with these products, with our innovations line, we are specifically supporting the mission of the agency, and that is to provide educational materials to students and individuals who are blind or visually impaired for lifelong success. And so to bring a bit of information about one of those products to you, one of them is called the TactPlus Printer. This is a solution that we've been marketing for roughly a year or so. It prints 3D images. So an example would be creating a tactile map or maybe a graphic for one of your STEM classes. And what it does is it allows you to bring that graphic and Braille onto a specialty capsule paper, right? So the way that this would work, or the process would be that you would create that graphic using a program that you already had. An example would be Corel Draw, for instance, or maybe Microsoft Word. Solutions that many of you who are orientation mobility instructors, or maybe tactile graphic artists or transcribers would be familiar with doing. The other process would be to import something, for instance, out of our tactile graphic image library. Once you grab those or create those materials, you'd be able to add Braille to them with the Braille font, and then you would just simply print them out. And to the left is an example of a map that has been created with some Braille on it. So just a few lines. You notice there are some different textures as well as symbols that are in that. And it's just simply a path and a few streets that are in this map to the left for those of you who need a little bit further description. And this next slide talks a little bit about the price of this product. And the image is actually of a dragonfly and a butterfly. And again, there are different textures in that butterfly and in that dragonfly. So a printer, TactPlus printer and paper bundle from APH would be about $3,700. Again, if you are interested in samples of what this would create, or if you have any questions, we would encourage you to reach out to sales@aph.org or to reach out to us at 800-223-1839. All right, so moving on, a little bit about our presenter. Daniel Kish is an American expert in human echolocation and the president of World Access for the Blind, a California registered not-for-profit organization founded by Daniel in 2000 to facilitate the self-directed achievement of people with all forms of blindness and increase the public awareness of their strengths and capabilities. Daniel and his organization have taught a form of echolocation to at least 2,500 blind and visually impaired children, as well as individuals around the world. Our objectives for today are as follows. The participant will identify at least 2 disruptive mechanisms of self-determined freedom of movement. Our participants will identify how the brain naturally acquires self-determined freedom of movement using environmental information. Participants will identify at least 3 perception-based principles to help activate brain mechanisms to foster self-determined freedom and achievement, even when this process has been disrupted. And finally, participants will learn at least 3 strategies for fostering development of 4 major brain processes: perceiving, acting, thinking, and socializing. Now, I realize that many of you had maybe joined or registered for this last minute. I believe we sent these objectives out to you prior to the event. We will try to drop these into the chat for you. So as you're moving through the presentation, if you're following along with these objectives, you'll be able to do so. All right, so again, continuing along. I mentioned that Daniel is a co-author of Echolocation and FlashSonar. Topics of this title include what is echolocation, how the brain develops and operates, optimizing learning conditions, how do I teach FlashSonar to myself and others, FlashSonar exercises, and the importance of echolocation and future research. This title is available through APH Press for $77. It is quota eligible and the category is orientation and mobility. So who is this appropriate for? This would be instructional manual for O&M instructors, adults who are blind and visually impaired, parents, administrators, and more. And without further ado, I'm going to stop talking. I am going to stop sharing, and I am going to kick this over to Daniel.
So you're going to hang on a second because Daniel had technical difficulties and he popped off and is popping back on right now. So again, he is in his home in California and he will be presenting, actually, I think it's his living room that he is presenting from. And so give him a second to get set up. So I have placed in the chat the different links, both Daniel's webpage as well as the links so that you could find that book if you needed more information. And then Daniel has also shared with me that he really wants to hear from you as well. So I am also going to give you his email, Daniel, D-A-N-I-E-L -Kish, K-I-S-H, at World Access for the Blind, no spaces, .org, so that you have his email, and he did say to feel free to contact him to find out more information.
So I guess it's one of those moments where me being a little long-winded wasn't necessarily a bad thing.
That is
One of the
correct.
few instances.
How you doing, Daniel? Can you hear me?
Okay,
There.
can you see me? All right. Okay.
Yes, there
Not
you go.
sure. I'm not sure what happened. Not sure why it happened. You guys
Well,
just
we all
suddenly
go through it.
disappeared.
It's okay.
All right. Let me just put everything back in place here. My apologies. Technical things.
And social distancing, so you are on your own.
Indeed. Okay. How does that look?
You are perfect.
Looks
Take
great
it
now.
away.
Excellent. Thanks everyone for showing up. This is what the book looks like. Um, it is obviously available for sale. There is a preview of the textbook on our website. The link will be given or may have already been given. There are also videos on that page. Oh, you know what? Sorry, hold on. I need to turn off voiceover as it babbles in my ear. Give me a moment.
Yep.
There we go. Okay. I urge you, on that page is a additional learning resources section or additional learning materials. And there are a bunch of videos in that section that I normally play, except I'm not going to play them in this presentation because there's a lot of material to get through and it's silly for me to play them when you can just go watch them yourself. However, I will be referring to those videos. So when you watch them later, some of the material I cover will make more sense. I believe there were 2 videos that were given out that were recommended for you to watch, one of which was a 21-minute documentary that was done in Australia that covers a lot of the material that I will cover. And then there was another one about a workshop that we gave in Vermont. If you haven't watched those videos, I urge you to do so because it will help to put all this in context. I'm squeezing a several-day workshop into an hour and a half, as well as a 500-page textbook into an hour and a half. And so I can only touch upon a few of the points that I would normally go into in considerable depth when I have the opportunity to do so. The professional development workshops that we do are commonly anywhere from 2 to 5 days of intensive work. I've been blind for 53 years. I've been teaching for over 25 years. I've asked a lot of very hard, very challenging questions about our profession, about how we do what we do and why we do what we do, and why we should maybe consider doing things other than what we do, right? So I really have a lot of thoughts about all of that, some of which I will share with you this morning. So I'd like to start at the end and work my way backward because everyone wants to get straight to the FlashSonar piece, right? Normally I like to do the foundation, or my mind works this way. I like to do the foundation and then I like to build on the foundation. And then the FlashSonar comes sort of at the end and everyone gets really impatient. So I'm just gonna do the FlashSonar bit first because that's the ooh-ah of this whole thing. What is this all about? Why is it so cool? If you watch the video, you will have seen you will have seen blind people doing a lot of things that are not commonly attributed to blind people doing, wanting to do, or being able to do. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about how that's even possible, what some of the principles are around FlashSonar. So FlashSonar is kind of what it sounds like. It's a sonar, sound goes out, it bounces back, and the visual cortex of the brain can be taught to decode that information and actually extract visual images from that information. Now, the implications of this are far-reaching, and there's a lot of research right now, most of which is coming out of Durham University, much of which I have co-authored, that we really need to be seriously asking ourselves about as a profession. If you put someone into an MRI scanner and they are a proficient echolocator, meaning that they use echolocation as a principal means of navigation in daily life, okay, not just sort of a passive echolocator, not just someone who says, yeah, I use that, but not really, you know, kind of thing, but someone who really does actively use echolocation, and you put them into an MRI scanner, you see their visual cortex light up. You see the visual part of their brain light up. It is very clear, given the multiple studies we've done, that the visual brain is processing this information and presenting images to the conscious mind, images that are visual in nature, visual in character. So we should be asking ourselves, well, how do we make this capacity to engage the visual brain in a blind individual available to more blind individuals? We're always talking about helping blind people learn to see, right? I mean, there's a whole lot of dialogue around teaching blind people to see. Wouldn't it be nice if blind people could see, blah, blah, blah. Well, this is a way to do it, quite literally. It is a way to plug audition into the visual brain and teach the visual brain to use auditory information to see the environment around, you know, the host, the person carrying the brain. So that's the first issue, is teaching blind people to see. That should be a big deal. I mean, I would think that would be huge. And I will also dispel a myth, and it is a fairly commonly held myth, that you have to be congenitally blind to be able to do this. I've heard this from multiple sources, and it is a myth. It is incorrect. Many of the people we work with are blind later in life. In fact, some of our instructors, blind instructors, were blind later in life, and they learned the skill well enough to actually be able to teach it, and teach it well. So I can assure you that this idea that you have to be born blind or nearly born blind to be able to do this is absolutely wrong. So the other thing we should be asking ourselves is this: what does it do to the auditory system if you're able to echolocate proficiently? Now let's think about this for a bit, and then I'll get on to some hands-on demonstrations, because I know that's what we're all waiting for. Some of the research that's coming out of Durham University right now basically indicates that proficient echolocators are able to hear a stimulus, a signal, something they want to hear, more easily and more accurately in noise. Okay, what are the implications of that? So if you're an echolocator, echoes are almost always the quietest thing in the environment. They are almost always masked. We all know what masking is. Masking is when a sound covers up another sound, okay? So one of the most common examples of this is cocktail chatter. So if we're trying to follow a conversation in a noisy room of 100 people conversing, how do we do that? How do we follow a conversation in a room of 100 people conversing? Well, you know, the research shows that a proficient echolocator can do that far more easily than a non-proficient echolocator, blind or sighted. A proficient echolocator on a daily basis is constantly extracting the quietest sounds in the environment from noise. By definition, echoes are the quietest sounds in the environment, and they are almost always masked by other sounds, especially if you are traveling in metropolitan areas and so forth. Another myth, okay, mythbuster, that echolocation doesn't work very well in noise. Incorrect. It does work just fine in noise for people who are proficient at it, for people who use an active signal, such as a tongue click, which I will talk about. That active process of actively inquiring information from the environment allows an individual to extract echo stimuli from noise. Now, Good for us echolocators. We can extract signals from noise by at least tenfold, I think. The data aren't out yet and they haven't been published, but the difference between the capacity of a proficient echolocator from a non-proficient echolocator to extract information from a noisy environment is really quite extremely well developed as compared to non-proficient echolocators. So it's not subtle, it's not slight, it is hugely, hugely significant. What are the implications of this? Well, everything. Because it's not just about extracting echoes from the environment, it's just about extracting any sound from the environment. So what are some of the biggest concerns these days? Well, finding someone you want, following a cue in the environment, listening for sounds that are relevant, finding an escalator, finding a customer service counter, using auditory cues that are perhaps embedded in the environment. One of the most common concerns these days are quiet cars, which anecdotally don't tend to bother proficient echolocators very much. I won't say that I've never been surprised by quiet cars. I know sighted people who've been surprised by quiet cars, okay? But proficient echolocators are able to extract stimuli from the environment in such a way that quiet stimuli are less susceptible to being masked, meaning that we, who are proficient echolocators, are able to hear them more effectively. So these are the kinds of things that we really need to be asking about as a profession. We need to get off our traditions and get into modern times and modern science, which means we need to look at the modern science, which occurs outside our profession. The science of neurology, the science of perception and action, the science of audition, the science of parapersonal space. I'll get to that in a minute. The science of sensory integration brought to us by the occupational sciences. There's a whole world of tangential scientific disciplines out there that we as a profession, in my humble opinion, are missing and missing out on. And so modern times are kind of passing us by, and we need to really get on track with that. Okay, so what does all this mean in terms of practice? So what I will do is I'm going to start with the basics, and this is often the basics where I start with FlashSonar. So FlashSonar is really a process of stimulus discrimination. We often think of it as in terms of detection, echo detection, detecting something. It isn't really about detecting, it's about discriminating a stimulus from its background, discriminating something from something else. This will be rather easy right now because there's not a whole lot of noise happening right here in this room. I have here a pot lid. You know, the first step is stimulus sensitization, so that the student, the learner, needs to be able to even know what it is their brain is doing. And I call it tickling the neurons or tickling the brain. We have to find the hook stimulus, the biggest stimulus that makes the brain go, aha, that's what I am listening to. This is overkill, okay? I'm just doing this so that every one of you can really hear this, right? So if we close our eyes for a moment, or look away from your screen, I'm gonna hold this in front of my face. I have my back to the camera. I'm not really sure why, because it doesn't really matter. And I'm just simply going to move this pot lid toward my face and away from it. And I think the microphone will catch the difference in sound. So the sound's going to be a sound, but listen to how it changes as I move the pot lid.
It worked fine.
Yeah, I figured it would, okay? So very simply, okay, if you watch the videos, among the videos, you will see one of our instructors setting a Guinness World Record by riding a bicycle around an obstacle course that he's never seen before by using essentially this principle. How can you ride a bicycle if you're echolocating? you click very fast, and you don't run into things. Okay, so to simulate a poll, we have something like this. Okay, so this is just a piece of it's a bread loaf pan, and all I'm going to do is move it side to side. So I'm going to make the same sound, and you'll hear the sound jump as this thing moves side to side. Right? So as it goes past me, that's like, okay, I'm passing a pole. All right? So if I'm Juan Ruiz and I'm riding a bicycle through an obstacle course made up of poles, I'm clicking, I'm scanning, and I'm listening to thin things, both to hear where they are so I don't run into them, and also to hear where they are so I can go around them without knocking them over in front of an audience of 10,000 Italians. Now, what if you have a student, and this is fairly rare, but it does happen. What if you have a student who cannot hear this? You present the panel, and they just can't hear it, right? So you clarify the stimulus, or you intensify the stimulus. You're looking to catch or hook the brain into the stimulus that are needed. Okay, this is just a salad bowl. I think I got this at the dollar store. Okay. There's almost no student we've ever worked with who cannot hear this, okay? So if, okay, almost everyone on earth can hear this. Even many of our hearing impaired students can hear this, okay? So once you get the aha experience, and they go, aha, I can hear that. We actually call it the aha experience. Then you can move back to the pan lid or to a much smaller panel. I'm just using this for now, but often the targets we use are smaller. And then lo and behold, they can hear this. So in 5 minutes, you've hooked the brain, and then you've extended the brain's capacity to hear smaller and smaller things. And then you complexify the stimulus. You move from larger to smaller stimuli, and you present the stimuli further and further away, okay? So with one student recently with whom we worked, I used a panel, and I put it all around his head, and I put it above him, and I put it below him, and he had to scan, click, reach out, and touch the panel. That's also very important, is reaching out and touching the panel, because that is coordinating the movement system, or my background is in perception and action. So it's coordinating the action system with the perceptual system. It's essentially training the directed reaching capacity, which we see in sighted infants at around the age of 10 months or younger, maybe 6 months for some. They direct their reach to things. Blind infants often do not do this, but it is a remarkably easy, I'll call it a reflex, but it's really a capacity to train, okay? If you have echolocation going on and they can reach out and they can touch a stimulus. And then for this student, we did the same thing with smaller and smaller panels, and he was able to learn to do this in a period of just a few days. Now, the other part of this is so we've done stimulus sensitization, we've done stimulus clarification. Anytime you have a stimulus that a student is having difficulty hearing, you intensify the stimulus. So if it's a pole that you want them to hear and they cannot hear it, let's find a larger pole, or let's find a pole that is more reflective, that stands out more. Many of the principles behind teaching FlashSonar, we also call it Sonar Vision, can be borrowed from visual efficiency training. We're talking about finding surfaces that are more and more and more reflective, okay? So the more reflective is a surface, you can liken that to higher contrast. So if a particular pole isn't showing up for some reason, you find a pole that is more reflective, either because it has more surface area or because the surface area is made of a material that's more reflective. The third is stimulus comparison. So you're comparing environmental features with other environmental features. So you're comparing walls versus fences, you're comparing poles versus trees, you're comparing tall objects versus small objects, wide objects versus narrow objects. Different sized bushes, different sized hedges. I mean, you just basically learn how different surfaces compare with each other. So a simple example of that would be an absorbent surface versus a hard surface. Okay, so we're back to the pot lid, and you can hear my voice, and my voice probably sounds pretty, I don't know, hard, okay, because it's reflecting off a hard surface. Versus when I move to this surface, okay, so what does that sound like? It sounds like I have my head in a, well, a bathrobe, okay, which is what this is, right? So, and then we go back to the hard surface, and that's the difference, okay? And that is analogous to the difference between, say, a fence and a wall, or a hedge and a wall, or a bench and a bush, or a tree and a post, okay? So and over time, and this doesn't necessarily take very long, over time you start to, the visual brain actually starts to present images to the conscious mind. So an image is not just a picture. I draw a difference between a picture and an image. An image is the composite of all sensory input, whatever that sensory input can be, whether it's from our cane, our feet, our hands, our ears, residual vision, it all plays into form an image. And all of that filters through what I will call the imaging system, often referred to as the visual system. But I think that's a misnomer, and I'm not the only one who thinks that the visual system isn't just about seeing through the eyes. It is first and foremost a spatial processing system which processes information through all sensory modalities, and if called upon to do so, can and will create vivid, functional, operational images from those sensory modalities. I'll pause here in case there are questions.
Well, you have an active listening audience. No questions have actually come in at the moment.
I have them mesmerized. Okay,
You do.
well, that makes my job easier. Okay. So let's then go back to how we do this. You saw people in the video. If you watch the video, and if you haven't, please do. You'll see people doing pretty darn, incredible things. Except for me, it's not incredible. It's a daily thing. I mean, I did all these things, as a kid, and I was not celebrated for doing so. No one ever came up and really told me that I was remarkable. And if they did, I didn't really believe them, right? Because I was competing with other sighted kids, And so, when you super clock your brain as a blind person to compete with sighted kids, you don't tend to walk away thinking what I just did was remarkable. You tend to walk away thinking, I've got to try harder, right? So I really didn't think of myself as remarkable, and I don't necessarily think of my students as remarkable. What I do think of, however, is that our nervous system is remarkable. We have a remarkable capacity to teach our nervous system to do just about anything if we present it with the challenge. So there are some principles I want to talk about here. Let me talk about how we came up with this in the first place. So we think of blindness as simply adapting to a condition. We do not think of it as a disability. We think it is problematic to think of blindness as a disability. We think of it as a distinctive ability. Okay, so the dis doesn't stand for lack of capacity. It stands for distinctiveness or distinction. Blind people have distinctive abilities, to be sure. Now, then we have to adapt to the condition of blindness. All right, so what does that mean? And this is spelled out in the textbook, like so many things that I'm talking about here. So let's draw an analogy between blindness and stroke recovery or traumatic brain injury recovery. Okay, and let's make this very simple. Let's just say here you are, you've had a stroke or a traumatic brain injury and you've lost the use of your right arm. Okay, that's kind of a bummer, right? I could use it, now I can't use it. Now, what's going to happen if we allow it to happen? If we continue not to use that right arm, your brain will essentially forget you have it. It will forget it ever existed. It's called learned non-use. And your brain just kind of cuts it off, like it never really existed, okay? So, you know, you can recover that right arm at any point, but obviously the sooner you do it, the easier it is. Our motto is the earlier, the easier, but it's never too late, okay? If I had my druthers, I would be called upon the minute someone goes blind, whether they're a newborn or whether they're 70 years old or 80. My oldest client was actually 83. He'd only been blind for 3 months, black blind as he called it, and he responded amazingly well to our training. He's not on our website, but we do have a student, I think it's called Kathy's Detailed Account, on our website somewhere, and she was in her 50s when she went blind, and she does detail her account, and she does detail how well she was able to use and apply our training. So we have several of those accounts. So actually many of those accounts. So so what happens here? So we've lost the use of our right arm. How do we get it back? We do two things. This is coming out of stroke recovery and traumatic brain injury, and it is somewhat controversial research. Okay, so I'm quite steeped in controversy. I love controversy because that's how we all learn new things. So you do two things. One is you put the right arm through lots and lots of intensive therapy. You really teach the brain that, wait a minute, this right arm does exist and it needs to be used. And you put it through these therapies. And the other thing you do, which is just as important, if not more important, and dramatically speeds recovery, is you constrain the use of the operative limb, the left arm. Now I am going somewhere with this, okay? You constrain the use of the left arm, you tie it up. Well, okay, we've tied up the use of the left arm, and we've put the right arm through bunches of therapy, and we do this for hours and hours every day for about 2 or 3 weeks. What are we doing? We are forcing the brain to acknowledge that it needs to use the right arm. So we are attacking two principles here, two principles, 2 in 1. One is use it or lose it, use it or lose it. If we do not use this arm, we lose it. Our brain loses its awareness that we even have it, okay? But if we use it, we reteach the brain that, oh yeah, I do have a right arm, and I guess I can use it. The second thing is need drives learning. We've created the need to learn to use or relearn to use the right arm by tying up the left arm, okay? And that is pretty critical to recovering the use of that right arm. Okay, so let's apply this to blindness. So if we think about blindness, what very often happens is you go blind or you're born blind. And what do we so often do? Well, we do two things. We turn to people who are sighted. Okay, so we turn to sighted surrogates. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, so much of our brain is devoted to social engagement and social interaction. It makes perfect sense and is actually quite adaptive to turn to sighted people who are able to provide all of the information that our eyes are no longer able to provide. That makes perfect sense, okay?
Daniel,
I'm not even saying it's, yes.
I hate to interrupt you, but
yes.
Your device just turned off your picture. Oh, and
Okay,
now it came back on. Go figure on that one.
Yeah, right. Okay.
I'm so sorry about that.
No, not at all, not at all, not at all. No,
it's back.
Please let me know. Please let me know. We're in the age of virtualization. We're gonna flicker and things will happen.
Yep.
So, it makes sense that we do that. And I'm not even saying it's wrong. What I am saying, however, is if we throw all of our eggs into that basket, we remove all of our eggs from another basket, And that other basket is the navigational capacity of the brain, self-guided freedom of movement. The navigational systems that exist in the parietal lobe, the mapping systems that exist in the hippocampus. I mean, there are systems that feed into I'll call it self-determined freedom of movement, self-guided freedom of movement throughout the brain. And if we throw all of our eggs into the sighted surrogate basket, we've learned to not use those aspects of the brain that allow for self-guidance, okay? And I'm saying you can have your cake and eat it too. You can put eggs into both baskets, but you must concentrate on recovering the basket that we've learned to not use, which is the self-navigation capacities of the brain. To do that, we need to go through a period of time where we're not using, where we've constrained the use of the sighted surrogate. So when folks go through my program, there is a period of time where they are not guided. There's a cold turkey moratorium placed on sighted guide, human guide, even verbal guidance, because if you do not do that for a period of time, you have a very hard time recovering the self-navigation systems, the self-guiding systems, the self-mapping systems. And we all know this. We all know, we've all experienced as we use GPS more and more and more and more. Okay, I have personally seen this in drivers. Okay, now they don't know how to map anymore. Okay, so if I had an audience in front of me, I'd ask everyone to raise their hand if they feel like they cannot map as well today as they might have been able to do 20 years ago, and enough hands will go up that I can hear them. So we've all experienced this. We all choose those battles. And as a blind person, you also have to choose that battle. How many eggs you want to put into the sighted surrogate basket? How many eggs you want to put into the self-guiding basket? I believe we can, cat, yes, hi. Yeah, meet my cat.
We've been watching him.
Yes, indeed. So we can do both, but we have to make a conscious effort to do both. And when I work with students, I work very hard to recover that self-navigation system. It doesn't tend to recover itself, okay? So one of the things we need to ask ourselves as a profession is we need to rethink human guide. Okay, we really, really need to rethink that, because in almost every single case when I come to work with a student, that is where I have to focus my attention. I have to recover the self-guidance systems, because one of two things has happened with sighted guide. Either it is used too much, or it is used in such a way that has relegated the student to a passive recipient rather than an active engager of the process. That is a whole other workshop. I won't go into that very much. I'm just here to tell you that if sighted guide is used too often, or if it is used too passively, it absolutely does erode the self-navigation systems, because use it or lose it, and the need drives development. If you do not need to develop those self-navigation systems or self-guidance systems, they will atrophy. They do atrophy, and then they need to be recovered. Okay, so the other thing that we tend to do is we tend to, okay, so if you're sighted and you go blind, and let's bear in mind, this is more questions we need to ask our profession. How did our profession develop? Well, it developed primarily by sighted people who were kind of armchairing a design for blind people to get around. And yes, we did trial and error, and yes, there was a blind person involved, but mostly it really was about sighted people trying to figure this out on behalf of blind people. Okay, if we're looking at that end of the profession, there is another end of the profession where blind people were actively working this out as well. And I don't want to give short shrift to that, but basically they were ignored, okay? To make a long story short. They shouldn't have been ignored, but they were. So let's focus on the sighted folks who had medical degrees who developed all of this. So if you put a blindfold on, any sighted person puts a blindfold on, what tends to happen? Well, two things happen. One is, where's the sight? Okay, so we start asking around for visual information. Not a bad thing, but it's a slippery slope that can draw us into where I just talked about. The other thing we tend to do is we tend to reach out. Okay, we tend to want tactile information, because what we're doing is we're reaching out for information that is as concrete as the visual information was. Also adaptive, also not wrong, okay? But let's remember, how concrete is this? Okay, that's pretty concrete. We don't tend to think of information coming through the auditory system as concrete, the way visual information is, or the way tactile information is. We don't tend to think of that, and arguably maybe it isn't, but it is enough. It is enough to trigger the imaging system. And if it is enough to trigger the imaging system, assuming it's active and assuming that we develop a proficiency, if it's enough to trigger the imaging system, then it becomes sufficiently tangible, sufficiently concrete, sufficiently palpable to actually be used in a functional way. But we have to do it. We have to make a commitment to do it, because for whatever reason, the brain doesn't often naturally go that direction. It does go that direction for many blind folks, okay, it does. But if you're blind later in life, that's not the direction it often goes. It often goes to touch, it often goes to, you know, hey, you tell me, you know, X, Y, and Z. We need to present the opportunity to the brain to plug auditory information into the imaging system. And when we do that, we do recover the imaging system. I'll pause for questions.
You have some now.
Okay.
So, and some of these came from the beginning section, so
Okay.
bear with me. So what if, if we understand the visual cortex as a processor of recognizing things, I think they're asking for your confirmation.
One of the functions of the visual system is to recognize things, to identify, recognize, classify, to register information. Yeah, so recognizing things. So yes, you can teach the visual system to recognize things through sound as well as touch, and the visual system will jump on board to allow for recognition of stimuli through other sensory modalities besides vision.
Okay. Would damage to the parietal lobe disrupt the ability to use FlashSonar?
It wouldn't disrupt the ability to use FlashSonar any more than it would disrupt the ability for a sighted person to use vision, right? If you had vision and you incurred damage to the parietal lobe, I mean, there are lots of sighted folks who struggle with navigation, right? You know, and you wonder what happened to your parietal lobe. So, I mean, so navigation, whether you're sighted or blind, navigation is a whole brain function. There are some people who would say that 80% of our brain is devoted to visual function. I wouldn't necessarily put it that way, but I would say that 80% of our brain or more is devoted to navigation of some form or other. It's devoted to interacting with our environment, okay, and navigating that interaction. So, you know, I have worked with students who could use FlashSonar perfectly well, in the sense that they could hear the stimuli perfectly well, they could recognize the stimuli perfectly well, but they may still have navigational difficulties because of potential damage to either some of the mapping systems or some of the navigational systems. And then you just have to work with that, knowing that that appears to be the case, and that's another workshop.
Okay. So does high frequency hearing loss impact the ability to discriminate echoes? And if it does, is there a desirable range of frequency?
So, so with echolocation, you have a range of frequencies. And to put it again simply, lower frequencies travel further, higher frequencies give you detail. So if a person is challenged by high frequency hearing loss, they may have some difficulty with detail. okay? So they may have trouble distinguishing, I'm making this up, but maybe distinguishing a bush from a bench or a fence from a wall, okay? But it may not affect their ability to perceive from a distance at all. A person with significant high frequency hearing impairment might still be able to hear a building from 100 meters away or more, okay? So they just may have more difficulty with those fine-tuned discriminations that tend to lend themselves to higher frequencies.
Okay. Is part of the reason you are so good at echolation is because you did not have a white cane?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. All right. Yes, and yes, but. So look, I would say that the main reason I am relatively good at echolocation is because I had parents who placed a huge value instinctively on my freedom of movement. I was not over-supported. I was not over-guided. In fact, my family was pretty hands-off. We were not a touchy-feely family. And so I was kind of thrown out there a bit to sink or swim. I chose to swim. And there was just a lot of emphasis placed on get out there and do it. And, you know, don't come crying to us too often. Not to say that I wasn't supported. I was supported. There was nurturing, but it was that feeling of you're blind, you know, get past it and learn to manage. Okay, that is true in a nutshell. That is true. And there were lots of very positive factors that fed into my capacity to develop self-guided movement from very, very, very early in life. Now, I'm here to tell you this, two things. One, if I had been provided with a cane early in life, which I was not, I'm 54 years old, we didn't do cane training for young children back then, and we should have, and we should today. I am a proponent of getting a cane in the hands of blind children as young as not, okay? As young as 0, as young as birth, I don't care how young you are, you can learn to use a cane age appropriately and functionally, and it does fast track the development of the perceptual system and the development of the movement system. So I didn't. And my mobility would have been easier, better, more prolific if I had. I'm here to tell you, my mobility was good. It was good. It was always good. I was always an independent traveler. But it would have been better. It would have been easier. And it would have been much less traumatic as the world got bigger and more complex. As a teenager, I suffered lots of those self-confidence issues, self-conscious issues, self-questioning issues, a lot of stigma around using the cane, which kids who were exposed to the cane from very early in life don't tend to have or have much less than I did. And it was a pretty serious issue for me. So I'm a huge, huge proponent of early cane training for blind children. And I have a whole set of protocols for doing that, most of which it looks like I won't be able to get into today. But it's in the textbook. Now, here's the thing. All right, the rub is need drives development. I needed really good echolocation. If I'm traveling around without a cane, I need to have a really, really good awareness of what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, really good mapping systems, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, all those things develop for sure, okay, for sure. I would trade in 25% of that capacity if I had been given a cane at an early age. I would do that, okay? But there's no need to do that. You can develop both. I mean, when I work with kids, I put them through the ringer. I mean, it doesn't really matter how young they are. They're learning to use a cane. They're learning to use their ears. They're learning to use their hands, their feet, their whole body. And we just ramp up the activity and capacity to bring the perceptual system online as much as it needs to happen. So I don't feel like there is a sacrifice to be made necessarily by providing young children cane training. I only see positives. I do not see negatives, any negatives in early cane training. And those negatives that have been brought up are this idea that it affects your posture and that kids aren't developmentally ready, and they're wrong. There's no data anywhere to support that position. In fact, some of the best research right now is coming out of Australia for early cane training, kids who are 1 year old, 2 years old, early cane training. It's all positive.
I am going to pause with questions and let you go on.
Since we got onto the subject of cane training, I would like to talk a little bit about that. So these days are the days of activities of modern science, fishing poles, fishing and running and skiing and golfing and all the things that we do, that we buy the best thing for us to do these things. We buy the best shoes, we buy the best golf clubs, we buy the best whatever, okay? Bicycling, and it turns out that there's a science called parapersonal space. It's basically ergonomics that essentially says that we adjust our body schema to adapt the use of tools. Fencing, I mean, anything we do with a tool, we extend our body space through that tool, okay? So this is a big deal for anyone who is a hobby enthusiast, a sports enthusiast, or anyone who uses a tool for any purpose at all. And there's a lot of science behind this, a lot of science behind human factors and human ergonomics. Why have we not done this in terms of canes for blind individuals? Okay, we have kind of more or less stayed with the same cane dynamics, give or take, for the last 50 to 70 years. So why don't we actually show the first slide, the Vitruvian man. The Vitruvian man is basically
you can go on, and I will get
I
Jim
will
to do that.
You know what? It's not actually absolutely necessary. Okay, it's all right. So all the Vitruvian man shows us is an illustration that we are as long from fingertip to fingertip, as wide from fingertip to fingertip as we are tall. Okay, so that's more or less what the Vitruvian man shows you.
And you showed us very well.
Yeah.
Okay, Jim is now showing it, so we can see the actual picture of the cane on top of the Vitruvian man. You made a good Vitruvian man.
Oh, thank you very much. Clothes on, though, in this case. So I love this cane. Done. Okay. Love it, love it, love it. What I would say is that what I have found is that both personally and professionally, if the tip of the cane lands roughly one body length ahead of the individual, ahead of their core, okay, roughly one body length ahead of their core. So that would look something like, I don't know if you can see, something like this, okay, roughly. If the cane tip lands roughly one body length ahead of the core, I'm here to tell you cane training occurs faster, easier, better for a wider range of people in a wider age range. It almost doesn't matter who you are. This is a particularly cool cane. It comes from the Czech Republic. I will provide a link to this. They're hard to get in the States. They will send to the States, but you have to order. There's no distributor in the States for these. They're called Swarovski canes, and almost everyone absolutely loves them, okay? The next best thing, in my opinion, would be, and this is my opinion, but it is a very informed opinion, would be the NFB cane, which looks a bit like this. okay? Now, the reason I have these canes hanging on here is you can see, I think, the disparity between weight. One of the things about ergonomics is weight. It's how easy it is for the perceptual system to adopt the use of the tool. And one of the things that tends to correlate with adoption of a tool is weight and balance. Weight and balance. Okay, so this cane, the one on the left, what I have here, the folks who can't see this, is I have a scale, courtesy of a coat hanger. And I have, on the left end of the coat hanger, I have a sternum linked cane, which would be more or less standard issue. I do fully well know that many instructors have come on board and do recommend canes that are an inch or two longer than this. Okay, so I get that. But I very often see canes issued of this length, you know, still the 2 inches above the base of the sternum kind of length, right? Often with a marshmallow tip. I don't go for the marshmallow tips. They're too heavy, all right? So when we put this cane on this hanger, please allow me to do that. That should be easier. There we go. You can see that even though the cane is shorter by 10 centimeters or something, it is heavier. And so you can see how much heavier it is, okay? Whenever I present the two to a child, they almost invariably choose the longer, lighter cane, okay? And then when I show the parents, hey, look at this, and I show the parents, I almost always get a, wow, that really makes a difference. If you're using your cane on a regular basis all the time, which, you know, 50, 60, 70 years ago, let's face it, blind people weren't. I really don't think they were expected. I really don't think they were expected. Hey, I mean, I'm 54 years old. I know we weren't expected to travel as prolifically as blind people actually do and actually can, okay? And so the more blind people have traveled, the longer we spend using our cane, the lighter the canes needed to be, and quite frankly, the longer they needed to be in order to foster, in order to activate adoption into our perceptual system. That's a whole other workshop. I mean, there's a whole lot of science behind this. Much of it is spelled out in the textbook. There was a study done not too long ago by Western Michigan, which compared cane length, roughly the traditional length cane, sternum length, to longer cane. I believe the longer cane was 20 centimeters longer than the shorter cane. The problem with that study is that although they did test one cane versus a cane that was, I think it was 20 centimeters longer. I don't have the study in front of me, but it's out there. One problem with the study, and it was a very serious one, is that they did not adjust the cane lengths to the height or body proportions of the students. So the participants. So all the participants were given the same two canes, regardless of their height and regardless of their body proportions. And when I say body proportions, to put this delicately, people who have thicker body proportions also benefit from a longer cane because there's some ergonomic difficulties getting the cane arc effective. So, you know, they can't get it past their belly. Okay, how else can I put it? So it helps to have a longer cane. Body proportion and body height were not factored into this study. In my opinion, that completely nullifies the results of this study. Okay, so we haven't studied the ergonomics of canes for blind individuals across the age range, across culture, across environments, and across backgrounds. So what I have found, having worked with, my youngest student was 7 months, my oldest student was 83, I've been to 40 different countries. What I have found is this ergonomic. If the cane tip lands roughly a body length away from the core of the individual, that speeds ease and effectiveness of use of the cane by a lot, okay, by a whole bunch. When we look at where sighted people gaze, when they are traveling in unfamiliar, uneven terrain, there is research on this that actually looks at where sighted people gaze in unfamiliar, uneven terrain, they tend to gaze predominantly roughly 2 to 3 steps ahead of their center position, okay? And so what I'm saying here is actually more or less analogous to the visual system. The cane effectively becomes a vision substitute. It becomes a sensory substitution device, substituting for vision, feeding into the preview system, which I didn't make that up. There is such a thing as a preview system, feeding into the preview system information very similar to and analogous to visual information in this case. It is so powerful that even if you put a cane that's you know, as tall as a toddler, a blind toddler, if you put a cane in their hands and they use it as a cane and they just simply have the tip in front of them, their posture, not only does their posture improve, but their stability improves. So the cane provides a third point of reference, just like the visual system provides a third point of reference, and it noticeably affects their posture and gait. The other thing real quickly is I do not teach pointer grasp, this versus, I'll just call it open palm because that's what the NOMCs call it. I don't actually call it that. I call it handshake. It's a little bit different, but it's similar, okay? So the pointer grasp, hinging the wrist side to side, I don't teach that because students are developing wrist issues. Physiotherapists are talking about this, and we don't have an answer for them other than this is just how we've been taught to teach. So one of the first things I do when I work with a student is I unteach the rigidity and mechanics, the rigidity of the cane mechanics they've generally been taught, and I go back to what is natural movement for them. And it usually looks more like this. A relaxed arm, the wrist is turned so that most of the energy comes either from the hand or in some cases from the arm. You sometimes see this kind of thing. Because this repeated motion of the wrist is just a recipe for wrist problems. I was developing them and I've worked with many students who are developing them. So these are just some things we as a profession are not thinking about as a profession. Many individual instructors are thinking about this. Much of what you are hearing from me right now didn't just come out of my own brain. I have worked with literally tens of thousands of professionals across 40 countries. I've delivered maybe 1,000 professional development workshops to well over 10,000 instructors, and many of them have come to me with their own thoughts, their own ideas. This is what I have found works, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then of course I pull that in to a system that over time has become relatively comprehensive. Yes, some of it has come out of my own experience and my own observations, but a lot of it has come from individuals in the field who have individually determined that certain things work. Other questions?
Yes, you mentioned integrating 2 systems in the reaching to touch, the motion system and what other system?
Okay, so so my background is in perception and action. So it's basically the perception and action system. So to put it simply, you know, let's say I'm a student and I hold the panel out and I say, where is the panel? And they click and they target the panel. You point your nose at the panel, then you reach out and you touch the panel. So it's one thing to know it's there. It's another thing to direct your movement to the panel. And you often see a calibration period. What you often see initially is this kind of thing, or this kind of thing. You know, they're reaching just past the panel or just beneath the panel or just above the panel. So, but over time, and not a long time, it's usually only a few tries, they actually learn to calibrate the action system with the perceptual system. The two really should work together, and we can train those systems remarkably easily to work together.
Okay. Do we teach all sensory to objects in steps of individuals' senses first before multiple senses at one time to get these visual images?
Okay. So
We've stumped you, huh?
yeah. Yes and no. All right. So here's what I have found. And all of this, every single last thing I have said here needs research. We need data. I am going on anecdotal information as well as personal as well as professional information. A lot of it, a whole lot of it, tons and tons and tons and tons of carefully documented qualitative information. Yes, but we also need quantitative data. And I don't have the resources to make that happen. So here's what I have learned. I have learned when I first started doing this, I took the cane away and we just focused on echolocation. We walked down hallways, we walked around the playground, we targeted things, we learned how to find things, we learned how to, track things, we learned how to recognize things. And by the way, I do at least 50% of my lessons in environments that students don't know, age appropriately, because that is when we are least complacent. Again, need drives learning. We don't, we are all more complacent, all of us, every last one of us more complacent when we are in places that are familiar with us. If we are not taking our students out of familiar places, we are not providing them with the opportunity to learn. That is a problem. It does not activate the whole learning system. It just doesn't. So we've got to challenge them by taking them into places they don't know. Okay, so we did this and they got really good at it. And then we put a cane in their hand and it all went to pieces. It just all fell apart, okay? So when it comes to tactual kinesthetic and auditory, or haptic and auditory, however you want to define that, I teach those together. The auditory system and the tactile system, I find, usually work very well together. There may be exceptions where you have to isolate and then integrate, but I generally find that they work well together. The brain seems to be okay with that. And the visual cortex, because it absolutely craves information from which to extract images, it'll just take that information right in, digest it very nicely, and learn to construct images from tactual and auditory information. Vision is a different animal. However, vision tends to gobble up a whole lot of brain real estate. Vision is, as one of my instructors who used to see and now doesn't, is a very loud sense. It clamors for attention. It does. So the way we work with people who have residual vision, yes, they can learn all of the blindness skills, and they can often learn them very well. In fact, they're sometimes our most motivated students because they know very well what happens to their vision when the lights go out and they don't like it. So we have to isolate visual occlusion as much as is possible or reasonable. Okay, and that's another workshop. I have tricks and I have tricks for visual occlusion to make it, not a horrible thing. So visual occlusion, and we learn the blindness skills, we learn to echolocate, and then we integrate the visual function into the non-visual function. And that is what I find, in a nutshell, that is what I find works best when you are working with residual vision.
Okay. If an object is below your head, does echolocation still work to locate it?
Thanks for asking that question. Absolutely, yes. It is true that head level objects are best. Okay, so no more banging your head on stuff. We've eliminated that problem. Hooray, it's gone. Okay, no more of that. Almost never. Head level objects work best. It is true that the closer you get to the ground, the harder it is. But let's keep in mind that we're really talking about surface area, okay? So if we have a device, if we put something on the ground that's like this, it's maybe, 2.5 inches, roughly maybe 6 centimeters tall, okay? And we put it on the ground. There is not a chance in Hades I will ever be able to detect that with echolocation. It's just not going to happen, okay? But if this same object were 10 feet long, I might, because there's enough surface area, even though it's very small. So an echolocator who is proficient can detect up curbs, can detect steps, can detect planter boxes that are low to the ground, can detect lots of things as long as there's enough surface area to bounce those things back. Of course, we have our cane, right? So if we don't detect those things, we have got our cane and that detects it for us. But we are able to detect those things if there is enough surface area.
So can you describe how echolocation
let,
changes in
I'm
surface
sorry,
texture? Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, let me just add. It also requires scanning. So echolocation is hugely benefited by head movement. Head movement is the equivalent to eye movement. Humans do not have motile ears. We would be better echolocators if we did. So we have to move our heads horizontally and also vertically, especially if we know we need to be scanning for something that is close to the ground. Okay, I'm so sorry. Okay. So,
no.
so
That actually answered a couple of the questions that were there. So I'm glad you added that, definitely.
Good.
How does echolocation change, how does echolocation for changes in surface texture differ from the three-dimensional objects? I'm not quite sure the question though. I think.
So with, okay, my interpretation of the question is basically shape versus texture. So it's one thing to use echolocation to determine, I won't say the exact shape of something. I mean, you can determine shape of something with echolocation, but that's really hard. That requires a really, really intense focus that feels a lot like rats gnawing at your brain. Yes, in a lab, in a controlled setting, you can determine shape using echolocation. Who really does that? Not many of us, even the most proficient of us. However, you can trace contour and form. So the general outline of things, absolutely. One of our videos shows a woman who takes her hand and she's following a car using her clicks, and she has residual vision. So she's got a blindfold on and she follows the hood of the car with her hand, keeping it about 2 centimeters above the hood the whole time. She follows it up the windscreen. She follows it across the top of the car. She follows it down the backside. And she's shocked at how well she was able to do it. And that's in one of our videos, okay? So, you know, she's echolocating the contour of something. You can echolocate contours. Now, texture and density really fall into the category of what scientists call depth of structure. Texture, you can echolocate, I'll call it gross texture, okay? So if something's like really bumpy, like, I don't know, tree bark, okay? Tree bark is going to sound quite different from just a smooth pole, or brick might sound different from glass. The sound, again, it translates into an image, but the sound is what you'd expect. It's kind of jumbled. It doesn't come back as a clear, smooth acoustic. It comes back as a bit of a jumbled acoustic. Same with density. So if you're clicking at a hedge, what you're basically getting is a composite cacophony of bits of elements that are all facing in different directions, plus lots of bits that scatter through the thing because it's less dense. Versus if I were clicking at a stone, and again, we have video that shows exactly this. If I'm clicking at stone, that's going to come across very differently. And one of the things we do with students is to help them learn to describe those differences, to language those differences. We find, or we think, that the process of languaging those differences actually helps to clarify the image, but it also helps to clarify people's communication of their own experience. Blind people do not tend to communicate their experiences to others in the same way that sighted people do, because sighted people love to talk about what they see. And blind people are often not encouraged to do that, or when they do that, it is often not received. So, yeah.
Okay. For students with balance issues or a very young student, do you have any advice for encouraging districts to allow you to introduce a cane for students with balance issues? And then what might you start off with a very young student, like a 7-month-old?
That becomes a case-by-case thing. And I personally have I've never yet found the use of okay, there are a lot of different ways to answer that question. Okay, so one way of answering that question is, do we think it's possible that if a student was able to use a cane, would that ultimately increase their balance? A lot of times what we have here is a catch-22. And I have seen this and I have worked with this. The catch-22 looking something like this. The student has balance issues. Therefore, we restrict the training of certain blindness skills because we feel the student can't walk or is unsafe to walk. However, if the student isn't actually walking, they never improve their balance issues, right? Need drives development. You need to walk to learn to walk. Even if you have balance issues, you need to walk to learn to walk. So I really push to get those balance issues going. Now, there are lots and lots of ways to do it, and it's a very individual thing. But what I do for some students, now again, it depends on the age, is I might have the student, holding, so I may hold a hand, so the student has my hand or a mother's hand or teacher's hand, and they have their cane in the other hand. So they're learning to use the cane, but they are also benefiting from someone to help them be stable. Ideally, you eventually let go of the hand. That's one thing that you can do. Another thing that I've done with students is the adult supports the cane, and then the student holds the cane further down, and they can use the cane. Again, it depends on the student. They may be able to use the cane to support their balance and also learn over time to use the cane as a cane. This is a developmental process. While we do sometimes get immediate aha experiences and we see their brain just kind of, go off like a big bright light, more often it takes days or weeks or even months. Okay, but you've got to start somewhere. So this is another option, is the cane serves to help them feel secure, to help them with balance, and also they learn to use the cane. Another thing that we do is we have a hiking stick, and I tend to use hiking sticks rather than trekking poles. Hold on. Okay, so this is a hiking stick that I would use in the mountains. Normally you'd have one with a rubber foot, but it's an actual honest to goodness hiking stick. It's not an orthopedic cane. So you've got a hiking stick in one hand, and you've got, and I have done this with some students with resounding success, and you've got a cane in the other. So it looks a bit like this. Okay, so the hiking stick, actually that's too high. The arm should be about 90 degrees, yeah, more like that. Okay, so you've got the hiking stick in the left hand, the elbow is at 90 degrees, and you've got the cane in the other. The hiking stick provides stability, the cane provides perceptual preview. Okay, if you have more severe balance issues where the student is really in a walker or something, then it becomes a case-by-case thing. I have been able to get students out of a walker basically by believing that the student could. Okay. That's another workshop that, sometimes you just have to have faith that if you help the student aim for a goal, the goal gets achieved. And then in some of these cases, these goals were achieved.
I don't think we're going to get to all the questions because we are right at our end of time, but I do have
Yes,
one more that you did say
sure.
you would talk a little bit about and you didn't. You referred briefly to the different sounds that you make for echolocation. Is that something you taught specifically, or was it more instinctive? What do you do for your students that you
So
work with?
mostly it's a tongue click, and the click you want to avoid is what I call a cluck click. That does not work, and if you do teach that to a student, they'll just struggle with it and come to the conclusion that echolocation isn't really for them. So it's got to be a sharp type of a click, which I do have protocols for teaching. Those students who struggle with it, I will put this up on the website. We have these hand castanets. A surprising number of students really like these, actually, especially younger students. And there's a whole protocol for using these, which isn't in the textbook, I am afraid. This was a new development, but and there are articles that look at what kinds of clicks proficient echolocators tend to use. They actually go through the data of what these clicks look like. They are all very sharp. They are all very bright. They all scale their clicks to activity and environment. So for certain activities, it's quieter clicks. And for other environments or other activities, it's louder clicks, right? It just depends. You've got to be able to scale the intensity and volume of your click. And you will hear and see examples of this in the videos, and it is reviewed also in the textbook.
Well, I have to thank you so much, Daniel. This has been fabulous. There is no way we are going to get to all of those questions, and so I do apologize. I think we do need to work on scheduling maybe another webinar to get a little deeper into some of the different topics that you covered here.
Any of these, teaching infants and toddlers, teaching kids with special needs, the whole cane protocol, I mean, any of these could be their own workshop. And I am happy to either answer questions by email or arrange consultation time with anyone who would like that.
Jim, do you have anything you want to add to the end?
You know, along with a thank you for just a phenomenal and very interesting presentation with Daniel, and for all of you to join us on this Friday. Just these final thoughts. As we began, I talked a little bit about APH's innovation line of products, and the Sunu Band, which is a Sonar smartwatch, is something that APH has been marketing for a while, with the ability to do object detection at 16 feet outdoor and 8 feet indoor. So something to consider. And so with that, I'm just going to stop sharing the screen, and once again, say thanks to Daniel for his time and the preparation he's put in today. I certainly hope we can have him back. It sounds like you are interested in joining us again. So super excited
Sure.
about that.
Thank you, and thanks for everyone. Yeah, for everyone joining in.